Without further ado, I'm just going to pass this over to Bill Deukler. He really is a star among stars on our family office CIOs who provide a lot of wisdom and content, bring us all together to be smarter as we navigate whatever we're navigating. In this case, virus permeates everything, the vaccine, the implications. So over to you, Bill.
Sure. Mark, thanks so much. And I'm inspired by all my fellow community people here at 361. And it's great to have you all join us today for this update on the COVID situation. Thank you for making the time. I think that, it's interesting kind of standing where we are now here in 2021. If you recall, back January 6th of last year, the WHO announced that there was a mysterious coronavirus-related pneumonia in Wuhan. So that was back in January 6th. On the 21st, China confirmed the human transmission of the virus. On the 31st, the WHO declared a global health emergency. And then just a year ago yesterday, China noted that the COVID-related deaths exceeded those of the SARS crisis there in China. So we've come a long way, and from a lot of panic early on, and now we've got vaccines out there. According to reports that I've read, there are 192 vaccines under development, and there are 68 in human trials. And then there are 483 therapeutics that are in development, and 396 are in human trials. So I will defer to my panelists to correct me on those numbers. But nonetheless, those are some very interesting numbers, and clearly, we've come a long way. I thought that I would start out by just showing four quick slides, and then introduce my fellow panelists and hand the ball over to them, because they're the people you really want to hear from today. So let me see if I can get to this. If not, let's see, screen share. There we go. And let me convert here. There we go. Hopefully y'all can see my screen. So we're just going to start out, just to give us a little context. Here's a chart from Our World in Data with regard to daily new confirmed COVID cases on a 7-day moving average. You can see that US and Europe, that everybody seems to be paying attention to now, unfortunately we're quite the leader, but it's interesting that it shows sort of the 3-hump pattern, which is reminiscent of the pattern that was experienced during the Spanish flu, back 100 years ago. And also the fact that the third hump was the largest, and since the January peak, cases have been fortunately on the decline. When you normalize this by using cases per million, you can see that there's a lot more clustering, that goes on when you look at kind of the experience, if you will, country by country. And again, the end of year, beginning of the year period of time was pretty tough, for most countries. With regard to some of the countries that have come into focus because of mutations, Brazil, the United Kingdom, and South Africa, I just thought I'd show the curves, for us and them, separately, so that you could see how it looks. And again, these are the 7-day average of the cases, and then here they are normalized by using cases per million. And you can see where a lot of the experience is somewhat the same. I thought it was interesting that the UK actually exceeded the US on a per million basis in early January. So again, that's probably due to the variant there. let me go ahead and stop sharing here, and we'll get back. So I wanted to introduce our panelists who were all with us for the last update, and I'll kind of go in reverse speaking order. But Vishal Gulati is going to be joining us shortly. He was pulled away on an urgent call, but will be coming on board, very soon. Vishal is a venture partner at Draper Esprit, and he's an experienced investor in health tech, genomics, and synthetic biology. Vishal is a Rhodes Scholar and a former clinical virology researcher from Imperial College. So we're looking forward to having him join us very soon. Then we've got Glenn Grossman, who's going to be with us again this morning. Glenn is the former senior director, or a senior director at Novartis. He's recently gone out on his own, and I encourage you to talk to him more about his consulting. But he's an epidemiologist with over 20 years of experience involving various projects that were under the auspices of Medicare and Medicaid, the VA, CDC, and other commercial and governmental activities, here in the U.S. as well as outside of the U.S. And we're looking forward to his comments. And then also we've got Steve Cucciaro, who is joining us again this morning. Steve is President and Chief Investment Officer of 3Edge Asset Management based in Boston. Steve was previously founder and president at Windward Asset Management, which was a $20 billion asset management firm. Of note, he's joining us particularly because he's on the board of directors of the IHME, which is the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation. They are affiliated with the University of Washington and are able to corral 500 full-time data scientists, and they're involved in building out forecast models on diseases and health metrics. And so his expertise in that area is particularly welcome. Steve's going to lead it off for us. He's going to start out with an overview of the latest IHME models, and then also talk a little bit about the markets and where things are at the moment. And then we'll transition to Glenn following Steve's talk. So Steve, take it away. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Bill. I'm about to share my screen. Did that work?
Yes, we're seeing it.
Okay, great. And let me do this. All right, great. So as Bill mentioned, I am on the board of directors of the IHME, and timing wise, we just had our latest board meeting just a little over a week ago. So I had a chance to talk to Chris Murray, who's the head of the Institute, and talk about the latest forecast that just came out a few days ago. So happy to share the information. First graph I'd like to show talks about daily deaths, both in the past, but also our projection for the future. And I would point out that a big part of our forecasting has to do with seasonality. Unlike some forecasters, we are modeling coronavirus in 186 different countries and on both hemispheres, all simultaneously. So it allows us some excellent tools to test if the coronavirus is truly seasonal, amongst other factors. And we've concluded it was, and we were the first major forecaster to forecast the big wave that happened in the winter when others were forecasting a decline. And now we've forecasted that coronavirus, this current wave did peak in mid-January, and now things are getting better. So as you can see on this chart, we show the daily deaths that exceeded 3,000 per day during January when it peaked is now coming down and fairly rapidly. So that's good news. You see that there are 4 different projections going forward, and I'll explain those. The very bottom projection, the best case scenario, is not so realistic, but it's what would happen if the US adopted practices that are done in some countries in Asia where over 95% of the population wears masks. We call that universal masking. And so that's a best case scenario, perhaps not realistic. The next projection up from that is our reference scenario, what we believe is the most likely to happen. A step up from that is if some of the variants that are occurring overseas start to get more widely spread in our country. And then the worst case scenario is if states prematurely remove all restrictions and we go back to normal mobility. And you can see we'll have a second wave in the April-May timeframe. Now, there's a caveat to all this. There are two developments that have been concerning to Chris and the IHME. One has to do with the high number of people who, at least in surveys, have said that they are unwilling to take the virus. And this is not good news. An earlier survey showed only 54% of people surveyed said that they would be willing to take the vaccine. And fortunately, that's moved up now to 66%. And our hope is that as time moves on, more and more people get informed and are willing to take the vaccine, but that could be an impediment. But the second thing that's more worrying is right before a board meeting, Chris shared with us the details of a Novavax third stage clinical trial that indicated that people who contract the virus and develop antibodies are not necessarily immune to the variants. And in particular, what concerned Chris was what's called B.1.351, and that's in South Africa. And so he said that if that is true and it holds up in other tests, that could change this picture, that herd immunity is that much a distant concept, and that this is something where we might end up getting vaccinated once a year. This will be with us for a while. Or worst case scenario is that the variants come on board. We have even less protection than we think against the variants. And the bump that could happen in the May, June timeframe or April, May timeframe is worse than what we're showing in this projection. This next chart just shows simply the cumulative effect of those daily deaths. And you can see how, depending on which path we take, it makes quite a big difference. Our base case projection is by June 1st, we're looking at 630,000 cumulative deaths, which is not good news. The only good news is that the daily rate is going down now. Now, next, I'd like to talk about, and was asked to talk about, how the coronavirus is impacting the publicly traded markets. And it has major impacts, some very direct, some indirect, and I'll quickly go over those. First has to do with the tug of war between inflation and deflation. At first, the coronavirus has been a deflationary force. We've already had deflationary forces. The Federal Reserve Board is most concerned about fighting deflation. Growing debt burdens, slowing growth, and a lot of that's been the coronavirus, aging demographics, technology, all act as deflationary forces. And this has been evidenced by a very sharp drop in money velocity, or the rate at which money changes hands in the economy. And this is the one reason why, despite all the money printing and stimulus we've had since the financial crisis of 2008, a lot of that money is not changing hands in the real economy. It's inflating asset prices, but leaving consumer prices with very low inflation rates. This could change. And one of the indirect impacts of the coronavirus is that because of the big hit to the economy, and especially a certain tier of the economy that's especially suffering, there's been massive monetary stimulus to be followed very soon by massive fiscal stimulus. And while the Fed can only lend and not spend, the government can spend. And this could get the money in the hands of people. This could turn around the money velocity. And for the first time in a long, long time, we could start to see inflationary pressures. And that has impacts on the other capital markets. Now, the markets are excited that vaccines are here, Coronavirus seems to be improving. People are looking forward to that period of time where life will be normal, and the markets have been galloping higher. However, I would point out that over long periods of time, the price per share of the stock market index, like the S&P 500 index, must keep track of the underlying fundamentals like sales growth or earnings growth. And when investors get overly exuberant, the price per share climbs more quickly than underlying fundamentals. And then when they get more fearful, it comes down more quickly than fundamentals, but it always comes back and touches base. Right now, our price to sales ratio, or the price per share related to the sales per share, has never been at a higher gap, even worse than in the tech stock bubble. So while valuation has very little impact on short-term market movements, longer-term investors should beware. To look at this a little bit more comprehensively, we did a very detailed earnings model showing the impact of making reasonable projections on growth of earnings, on profit margins mean reverting, on what discount rate to use. And we can use very low discount rates now because interest rates are so low because the Fed dropped them to 0 to try to fight the coronavirus. But they won't stay at 0 forever. But even if we make assumptions that they'll be at ultra low rates for the next 20 years and then only go back to normal, we're showing now historically we are more overvalued than any time in history, even slightly more overvalued than the tech stock bubble. And then interestingly, on the left, I just want to point out there was a similar period a little over 100 years ago, and that was the Spanish flu. And Bill talked about that a little earlier. And the truth is that the Spanish flu lasted a little over 2 years, spanned 4 waves. And before the Spanish flu was done, the market started to take off. And it climbed rapidly in 2019 in anticipation of the eventual end of the Spanish flu. By the time the Spanish flu was over and people could get back to normal, interest rates and inflation climbed, and that knocked the market valuation, which had become overvalued. And we actually had a bear market that exceeded a 30% decline. So another interesting fact where sometimes history doesn't exactly repeat itself, but it could rhyme. In terms of looking at future returns, the earnings, the valuation model that we use has done a particularly good job at forecasting not what the market's going to do tomorrow, but what it will do over the next 10 years. And the blue line shows what the model expects real life valuations would be 10 years into the future. And you can see there's been a great fit going all the way back to the 1940s. And right now, what the market is saying, what the model is saying is that while we might continue to get a run up in equities, be careful, especially with any rise in interest rates over the next 10 years, US stocks are particularly overvalued. Next, what's an example of an asset class that, unlike US stocks, has been in a bear market since 2008 and is now starting to stir? And that's commodities. Commodities go through cycles. Commodities from time to time appreciate much more rapidly than equities and then fall much more rapidly than equities. We've seen these cycles going back to 1971. Right now, commodities have never been more undervalued or have never underperformed equities as much as recently. And now that we're fighting the coronavirus with massive fiscal stimulus and talking about infrastructure plans, et cetera, because prices have been so low, there will be supply disruptions, there will be some demand shocks, and we could see commodities prices being the new bull market and at least a good hedge against equities. So yes, there are many risks in the market. This bubble could continue, but what if, in particular, what if herd immunity for COVID proves to be elusive? Will we end up with a number of cycles going forward? So in summary, COVID has a huge impact on the economy, on the markets. We believe that there's a lot of exuberance about the potential end of COVID. We think that's leading US equities to become overvalued. There are other areas like Japan that are not overvalued. We think fixed income is not a great place have a large share of your money because the interest rate you're getting with these very low interest rates don't even keep up with expected inflation. We think real assets could be an excellent hedge in the current environment. And with that, I will turn it back to Bill.
Yeah. Steve, thanks so much. It was great to see the forecast models, as well as kind of juxtaposed to what's going on in the marketplace. And, clearly, I think optimism has been, helping to drive things up. So I think it's a great segue to bear down a little bit more on the virus situation. And I'll turn the mic over to Glenn. Glenn, I know you've got some really interesting things to share with us. So go ahead and step up here. Thank you.
Okay, great. Yeah, there's a lot of really interesting things. So I'm going to breeze through this. If you have any follow-up questions, I'm happy to answer them. Let me play. All right, so basically, here's the snapshot of where we are. It's hard to compare the three surges because if you'll notice on the far left, when we're looking at the diagnostic tests, if you recall back in March and April, we were doing abysmally poorly at doing the testing. So what's more interesting is to compare the hospitalization rates because the hospitals were doing a better job of diagnosing the patients in the first surge than the general caseload represented in the pink. So generally, the first surge and second surge were roughly the same size ultimately in terms of the hospitalization. They varied geographically and they hit the different parts of the country harder at different times. The third surge, going back to what Steve was just saying, there was definitely the strong seasonality component of this, as we see typically in respiratory illnesses in general, a lot of these seasonal respiratory illnesses, and so that's consistent with what we're seeing there. Let me go to the next slide. We continue to see a remarkable variation geographically. So although we're seeing a decrease across the board in all states, we see that the South is still doing considerably worse proportionally to the other regions in the country. And one other thing here, so in terms of the total cases that we're looking at, so far there have been approximately 27 million total diagnosed cases. This becomes important in a little while when we talk about chronic COVID and long COVID, which is now becoming a new epidemic, a new global pandemic. It's this new disease where it's sort of this immunological disease that hits approximately 10% of people who have been infected. But I'll get into that in a second. Here we're looking at the total number of hospitalizations. This does not account for the size of the states. This is just in absolute numbers, but it's useful because it represents where these patients are getting most, where the hospitals are being hit hardest with these patients across the United States in terms of where resources need to go. This slide is a little bit more interesting because it's normalized, and so it demonstrates how hard states are being hit relative to the size of their populations. And so you can see around 50% of the states are still stretched more than we would like to see. All right, here we're looking at totals number of deaths since around a year ago, since we really started looking at this back in early March during the lockdowns. During that period, around 1 out of every 715 people in the United States has died from COVID-19. So that's quite a lot. You see that there was variation across the states. Some states did better than others. Next, I'm going to go into variants. So United States has been doing particularly poorly at screening for the variants, for doing the genetic screening. And so it's interesting that a area like Britain, so looking at the UK variant, they were screening approximately 7 to 8% of all of the cases. Everyone that tested positive, around 7 to 8% of them were screened. So it was easier for them to identify and track the variants of concern. In the United States, we're only doing 0.3%, or I should say, as of the end of 2020, we were doing approximately 0.3%, which means that for every one positive sample of a variant of concern, it actually represented 333 population cases of that variant of concern in terms of this way the sampling worked. This has gotten a little better now since we have the new administration in the United States. They're ramping up their surveillance. I don't know what the sampling rate is currently. If we use the current 333 rate, I'll come back to this in a second, then that means that there are currently, so I'll jump back to what I was just about to show you, but basically the B117 is the UK variant, The B1351 is the South Africa variant, and the P1 is the Brazil variant. You can see that the UK variant is exploding in the United States. It's doubling around every 10 days. And based on the 333 or the 0.3% sampling rate, then that would mean that there are over 300,000 people infected in the United States with the UK variant. This probably overestimates it a little bit because our screening has probably improved over the last few weeks, but I don't have an accurate estimate of the screening rate. Going here for a second, the key thing I wanted to show is that there are a variety of mutations. It's basically all of the mutations working together as a team that are making the variants worse in some ways. United Kingdom is interesting, the UK variant, or in this case, we prefer to call it the B117, because it increases how contagious the patients are. It increases the transmission rate by around 50%. And in addition, it seems like it's increasing the fatality rate by around 30%. So not only is it spreading faster among people who get it, they're more likely to die than the ones who don't. That's interesting for the UK. The UK is susceptible to our current vaccines. And so luckily, as we roll out the vaccines, we don't have to worry about the current version of the UK variant. In contrast, the Brazil and South Africa variants are resistant to our current vaccines to one degree or another. We'll get into that in a little bit. But basically, that's the big concern that we have with the Brazil and South Africa variants. We are seeing the beginning of the UK variant gaining some of the mutations that are allowing the Brazil and South Africa strains to be resistant to the vaccines. So that's something that we're keeping an eye on. But right now, this is the big story that we're looking at. I'm going to jump through here just so I don't take up too much time. The question now is, how well do the vaccines protect against the variants? So interestingly, the first two vaccines that were released, the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines, most of those patients that were evaluated in the summer, early fall. And so there weren't that many variants out there at that point. And so they had it easier in some sense. It was easier for them to prove efficacy. In contrast, all the vaccines being evaluated now have to address all of the variants of concern. And so now they're being evaluated in South Africa, Brazil, or South America, lots of other places. Overall, here's the interesting thing for the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. It was shown to have efficacy of 72% against moderate and severe COVID-19 in the United States. But in Latin America, it was only 66%. In South Africa, only 57%. Novavax, also in South Africa, was comparing. They showed, interestingly, it was 60% effective among HIV negative patients, but far less effective among HIV positive subjects. And so that's something that we're following as well. So there is this variation. We are noticing that the current mRNA vaccines, when they're evaluated against the South Africa strain, are not doing as well. All right, this is at a high level. This is the comparison. Generally, the vaccines, the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, are very, very similar. And like I said, it's really hard to compare the AstraZeneca, J&J, Novavax vaccines because they're being evaluated in the current context of all of these variants of concern circulating, whereas Pfizer and Moderna got off easy because they didn't have so many mutations they had to work against. All right, high level. So here's what the percentage of the population that's been vaccinated in a bunch of different countries. Israel is clearly doing quite well. United Arab Emirates doing quite well. United Kingdom, approximately 20%. So on the right, you can see the percentages. So Israel has approximately 70% of the population has received at least one dose. United Kingdom around 20%. United States were around 14%. I'm going to go at the world is below 2%, but we're gaining, but some, you can clearly see some countries are doing better than others. Next, we can see the change over time. So usually you look at ramp up curves here, but you can see that in a lot of countries, there's sort of been this consistent incremental growth in terms of the amount of people being vaccinated. The United States is interesting, so I'll dive in there. Biden, when he first started, promised that within the first 100 days, there would be 100 million people vaccinated. Well, interestingly, you could see at the rate we were going on before Biden started his administration, we were already on target to be hitting over 1 million new vaccines administered per day. And so we're definitely well on target to significantly exceed the 100 million doses within 100 days. I just have a few more slides to rush through, and then we can open it up to the presentation. I don't want to hog all the time. Next is you can see that there's variation across the states in terms of how well they're vaccinating the population. To what Steve said earlier, there were a few things to discuss here in terms of vaccine hesitancy. We are noticing that vaccine hesitancy varies by geography, by rural versus urban areas and suburban areas, by race, ethnicity, and by socioeconomic status, as well as by political party. There was a lot of misinformation going around within the last year about the virus. And so we see a remarkable variation across political parties in terms of vaccine hesitancy that's going to need to be addressed. All right, a few more things. When we look at the second dose of the vaccine versus the first dose, what we're looking at here is what's called the neutralizing antibody. So the first dose does a pretty good job of preventing symptoms, of preventing severe disease, but it's really the second dose that prevents the spread and prevents the people being contagious. And so you can see that in the level of neutralizing antibodies that are produced. When we look at real world evidence, now that Israel has been vaccinating so many people, what we find is that approximately 92% of people vaccinated in Israel, that is proven 92% effective. So people who are not vaccinated in Israel now are 11 times more likely to be diagnosed with coronavirus. According to one sample, it was a little bit less according to another sample in Israel, but still a remarkable achievement. Also, what this reflects is in hospitalization rates. They already saw a drop of 60% hospitalizations among the first age cohort of 60 plus 3 weeks after the first shot. So remarkably quick impact. All right, now I'm going to be looking at vaccine resistance. So vaccine resistance is very similar to the concept of antibiotic resistance. If there are strains of the vaccine that are resistant rather strains of the virus that are resistant to the vaccine, then that means that if you put the mild pressure of the vaccine on them, then the variants of concern can escape and then can sort of replicate, and they're going to be more likely to accumulate over time as a result. It's the same concept of antibiotic resistance. Finally, two quick things, and then I'll end it. One is this concept of what does the next few months to few years look like. Currently, there are actually 7, or I guess now we have, so there's 7 human coronaviruses that people are thinking about. The first 3 are the highly pathogenic ones that people have talked about. So that was SARS in 2003, the Middle Eastern coronavirus MERS in 2012, and now SARS-CoV-2. In addition, there are 4 coronaviruses that have been around for years that circulate widely, and these just cause the common cold. And they're so common that almost no one except virologists even know the names. They just have code names, 229E and NL63, HKU1, and OC43. They're very low pathogenic, and they're just circulating widely, but they just cause the common cold. People get it for the first time when they're 1 to 3 years old, typically, causing the common cold, and then we're just reinfected every few years throughout our lives, and we don't even have symptoms frequently by the time we get older. So the big question is, will SARS-CoV-2 become a low pathogenic coronavirus? A lot of epidemiologists now believe that will be the case. And so what we're looking at here is looking at this question of herd immunity. And what we found, in this case, we were looking at one of these cold viruses, the human coronavirus NL63. When they were screening, this was, I think, looking at Kenya, but when they were screening over years, they found herd immunity was never achieved. And that's what we think is going to happen with SARS-CoV-2, that we're not actually going to ever achieve herd immunity. But that's not a problem, because what happens is you develop sufficient immunity to protect from symptoms, but not sufficient immunity to protect from spread. So at that point, all it is a common cold virus, and who cares? Because if you're not hospitalized from it, you don't have severe symptoms, you just get a cold, then the epidemic is over. In fact, the Spanish flu turned out to be something similar. The Spanish flu is still circulating today, or descendants of the Spanish flu, but we don't have the continued epidemic that we had in the first 2 years of the Spanish flu back in 1918, because of the same kind of idea that we don't have the severe symptoms once you've gotten it for the first time. And so anyway, so this is what our current thinking is. There's evidentiary support all sorts of modeling and some real world evidence that's been evaluated. The key question will be breakout of the variants of concern and how will we get that under control. We might need booster shots after the vaccine, maybe once every year or so. But I think probably for coronavirus, which does not mutate nearly as much as the flu virus, we probably won't even need to get the booster shot as frequently as we do the flu vaccine. All right, the last thing is the long hauler question. The reason I'm bringing this up is because a lot of people aren't talking about this, but it's becoming a serious issue. Approximately 10% of everyone who's been infected with SARS-CoV-2 goes on to become a long hauler, have chronic COVID. It's not a chronic infection. Instead, what happens is their immune system has been altered, has been triggered, and they have persistent symptoms. And some of these symptoms are terrible, where it prevents them from going to work and really prevents a disability, it presents as a disability for a lot of people. The symptoms include fatigue, muscle pain, brain fog, neuropathy, shortness of breath, many, many months after the infection has already gone away. It comes and goes for some people. We don't have a good handle on it. It does seem to be an autoimmune disease at this point. So when you compare the level of autoantibodies between people who are pre-pandemic, people who are acute COVID, who are hospitalized, convalescent, so people who are these long COVID patients, and then lupus, the SLE is lupus. You can see that the long haulers have autoantibody profiles that are extremely similar to lupus. And the fact that 10% of the population who's been infected has this characterization, this is enormous on a global scale. So this is something that even after SARS-CoV-2 goes away or diminishes to become a common cold, this is something that's going to persist that we're going to really have to be addressing long term. And with that, I give it back to you, Bill. Thank you.
Great. Terrific, Glenn. We covered a lot of material there, but I hope you all could digest some of that because it's really important. I don't know, Vishal, are you on the line as yet? There he is.
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Well, I'm sorry I missed some of Stephen's presentation and yours, but I have your slides, so I will review them afterwards. Thank you so much for inviting me. So I was going to talk about the global dimension of this because Bill suggested that that's what I should focus on. But as I started to work on it, it seemed that there were some other topics that were just too juicy to pass up on as a former virologist. So I have picked up a couple of things around the variants. Some of it will build upon what Glenn already mentioned, and some of them will contradict what Glenn has already mentioned, but very, very politely and respectfully. So I will. So Bill, should I just fire up my slides, or is that how we're doing it?
Yeah.
That's how.
Yeah. Go ahead. Right.
Okay. Fine.
Do a screen share.
So, okay. Done. So this is what I wanted to talk about, and you will see that it kind of slightly drifts. So it's, this is an interesting chart that I found, which was trying to quantify how COVID is today and how it has evolved across the world. This is a really interesting chart, which is daily deaths in each country or region as a percentage of daily global cases. So this is a really interesting metric, which is telling you which countries are having the most severe impact of COVID. And you will see that United States plus Canada and EU plus UK are still one of the most severely affected regions by COVID when it comes to deaths. And I think that is really, really fundamentally a very interesting picture, because it's of course it's very sad because most of us live in these parts, but also you see that more developed countries are affected worse in this particular case, which is completely counter-cyclical to what we are normally used to. And then then there is the issue of variants. And so the global picture, as Glenn pointed out, is evolving. And this chart shows the spread of new variants. On the left side, it is the British strain. On the right side is the South African strain. But the point I wanted to try and make here was that the main reason for having variants, which are going to make our lives really hard for the next several months or maybe years, is number of infections. So if we really want to reduce the impact of variants, the best thing we can do is to reduce the number of infections in whatever way we can. Because every time an individual is infected, the virus replicates inside their body, and that gives an opportunity for mutations to occur, and that also allows a variant to select itself and then transmit it to other people. The other point that I wanted to make in this slide is that it seems that the UK variant is actually very, very highly transmissible. We know that from several sources. It seems to be more transmissible than the South African variant, which seems to be, to me, that sounds like great news, because the British variant is going to continuously outstrip the South African variant. So if there was a competition, if the British variant is spreading faster than the South African variant, we will see more cases of that. And if those cases then have some residual immunity against the South African variant, we could watch the South African variant to slowly go away from the population. The sad news, however, is, as Glenn pointed out, that the UK variant is more transmissible and also more deadly. In fact, it being more transmissible is itself a much worse news than it being more deadly, because once it is more transmissible, you have more cases. So even if it was less deadly, you will still see more dead people. That brings me to the next point, which is how do you actually deal with variants? And the challenge, the biggest challenge I find is that vaccine alone cannot deal with variants. We will have to try every different tool that we have in our possession to be able to reduce the number of infections. So this idea that we can have a vaccine which we will give to people, and after that we don't need any masks and we don't need any travel restrictions, I don't think that that works. First of all, Glenn pointed out in his chart that after the first shot, you are still transmitting the virus, or you are capable of transmitting the virus. So you can't remove mass, social distancing, and travel restrictions in that period of time. But if you have new variants, if you remove those restrictions, you are more likely to start seeing more cases of people who have had the vaccine and they get infected by a new variant and they have a terrible outcome as a result of that. Luckily, so far we haven't seen that. So the data that I am looking for like a hawk, and I recommend that everyone should keep an eye on, is how many people who have been vaccinated have got an infection of coronavirus and have been hospitalized or have died as a result of that. When we start seeing those numbers, then we know we are in trouble. So far, we haven't seen that. The other thing I wanted to talk about variant is that typically vaccine escape mutants will only emerge once vaccine penetration is really high, which we don't have right now. So we have so much to look forward to in a bad way in this case. So the one last point I wanted to slightly disagree with Glenn on is about why this virus has not become a less pathogenic virus as it happens to SARS before that. And where I agree with Glenn is that only with the help of a vaccine, I think that can happen. It can't happen without a wide coverage of vaccine. So we will have to have a pretty high level of vaccine coverage for us to expect this virus to become like a common cold virus. And maybe Glenn and I can discuss that in Q&A.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with you on that for sure.
Okay, so this is the chart I made. I sort of made an animation out of it because I think it shows some really interesting data, because the speed at which Israel has ramped up its vaccination is phenomenal. It is, I keep looking at this chart. I have run this animation 10 times. And I will run that for you once again if you missed it. If I can try again when, wait a second, I think I have to go back to the slide for the animation to run. Sorry, but sorry, I don't think I can run it again. I just don't know how to do that. But I think the point that is worth making is that neither United Kingdom nor United States were able to bring to bear the resources necessary to scale at the level that Israel did. Of course, as a British citizen coming from a country which has just left the European Union, it's very good to see that they are behind us. So that's a pleasure. But otherwise, if you look at it in absolute terms, I think that we should have done a lot better. So the question I'm asking is this vaccine rollout going to build a new hierarchy of competence in this world in a geopolitical sense? Are we seeing a reorganization of the world around those who can and those who can't? And I think the next chart illustrates that much better. If you look at this chart, at least half of the countries are very similar in size and in GDP per capita. But if you look at the number of vaccines that have been given, you see a very wide disparity. And you start to wonder whether these countries, we have to relook at how we assess countries in terms of their ability to deal with such major challenges. And I will just briefly talk a little bit about the UK and how our vaccine program came along. So this chart shows you that, so over the last several years or decades that I have been involved in the biopharmaceutical industry based out of UK, I have watched our manufacturing industry around biotech being decimated. And we have virtually no manufacturing capacity in the UK because we never thought as a nation that was a core competence that we needed. We wanted to invent things, but we wanted other people to do the dirty work of manufacturing those things. And when this vaccine challenge hit us, we realized that we were going to be in trouble. But luckily, I rarely ever say that, we had venture capitalists to rescue. So if you have followed the UK's vaccine procurement program, it is run almost exclusively by VCs. And what they managed to do was to use the same skills we use as venture capitalists to identify products very early in their lives and try and bet on them. And also bet on them extremely strategically, because if you look at the chart, we bet on those vaccines where we had manufacturing capacity. So we picked the vaccines from various different platforms, and we picked the ones, and we advance purchased several million doses of the vaccines we knew we could manufacture if they came through. And very luckily, most of those vaccines have come through. So the first company you see in the first chart, that's a French company called Valneva. And the CEO of the company was on record, it's in a newspaper, saying that while the French bureaucrats were still thinking about what to do with us, the British government just sent us a 74 million euro check. So essentially, we basically opened the checkbook, we bought the capacity, and we bought the first rights of the first 60 million doses coming out of this new platform. So I think that what we found in that situation was that while the process of procuring vaccines in the EU was left to bureaucrats, in the UK it was left to venture capitalists. And as my personal goal of showing how great venture capitalists are, this is a really good example. So I think that one or two other things that I want to quickly touch upon. It is extremely important not just to vaccinate a large part of your population, but it is important who you vaccinate and when you vaccinate them. Ideally, you would want to vaccinate the whole country on the same day. And by the way, this is not a fantasy. It is done. It is done in case of polio. You vaccine 100 million people in the same country on the same day. But we can't do that because you don't have the manufacturing capability, because by doing that, you could reduce the spread of variants very, very quickly. But we can't really do that. But in the UK, we follow a very strict age-related criteria. So we start with the oldest people, and then we come down. And right now in the UK, even though we have less than 20% of the population covered, we have about 88% of deaths covered. So we have covered the population which was most susceptible, and where 88% of the deaths occurred throughout this pandemic. So we're trying to work through that. So if you immunize someone who's 80 years or older, it takes you only 20 people to immunize to save one life. But if you start immunizing people who are in their 20s, it will take you several thousand people to immunize to save one death. So this is a different approach that was taken. The second thing which UK did very differently from rest of the world is we were the first country to decide to prioritize the first dose of vaccine, which became instantly controversial because it seemed that people did not want to go beyond the label of the vaccine that was approved. But I think the calculation in the UK was very straightforward, that if you immunize a larger population and make people wait for their second dose, the number of infections you reduce is so much greater that you will have fewer deaths and possibly also fewer variants. And I think initially, after a lot of criticism that UK received as a result of this, I think more and more countries are coming around to this idea that that's probably the way to deal with the restriction in the doses that we have available to us. But by and large, my focus is now shifting away from the current vaccines that we have. My focus is now shifting towards nasal vaccines because they're easier to give and they create IgA immune response, which will also spread because we may get a sterilizing vaccine, which is different from a neutralizing vaccine, which we currently have. Sterilizing vaccine means that it decisively stops the spread of the disease as well as adverse events like deaths. And it will also be easier to deliver to large populations very rapidly. So that's one area that I'm currently looking at. And maybe if we have another session like that, I would like to discuss the nasal vaccines in development. And the second area that I started to look again is therapeutics, because I do believe that with the variants coming online, we do have to think about therapeutics much more seriously. And I think that if we have a useful therapeutic, especially the one that works at an early stage, we should be able to do human challenge trials for new variants. And what that would mean that we could get vaccines out very, very quickly if we needed them, because we can't do that right now. It's not ethical to do it because you don't really have a treatment in case someone who's exposed to the virus develops a severe disease. So that's all I wanted to talk about. Sorry, it was a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but happy to answer any questions.
Oh, Vishal, that's terrific. Thanks. I think, so much of us, here are based in the U.S., so we have a very U.S.-centric view. So it's really, really helpful to understand what's going on, outside of our borders. And you hit on the therapeutics, and there've been some questions sort of offline amongst the 361 community, sort of asking for a little bit more thought about that. I guess there are sort of two, in terms of what we hear just out there, it seems as though there are two classes, sort of the pharmaceuticals and then kind of common everyday things that people can take. So on the pharmaceutical side, the names that have been thrown around a lot, ivermectin, Regeneron, remdesivir, and I just saw a new one based out of Israel, CD29, and all those, seem to have some, reasonable impact, on the virus. Can, you, Glenn, Steve, do you guys, have any thoughts on, kind of the pharmaceutical end of the therapeutics? Oops.
Yeah, I'm not prepared to talk about that today. There's some very interesting things that are in the pipeline, but there's a lot of things are really early. I've been seeing a lot of publications in the just general press, and it's so early that it's hard to say one way or the other for me as an epidemiologist.
Yeah.
So I think maybe I think there is a couple of things worth mentioning. So you mentioned, Bill, a number of things, and I think it is, you can almost rank order them to how much impact they can have in terms of area under curve of impact. And you can have things like remdesivir, which unfortunately has a very low effect size. So the difference between the people you give it to and people you don't give it to is not very, very big. And it also, unfortunately, can only be given at very late stage of the disease. So I think that if you think of those types of drugs, those drugs can be quite useful and very powerful sometimes, but their overall impact on the pandemic is going to be quite small. Because what you can't do is, on the back of something like that, open up the economy, because you will still have intensive care units which will be overflowing, and you can only help people right at the end of that journey at a very high risk and at a very high cost. So unfortunately, even if remdesivir was 10 times stronger than it actually is, it would probably not have a huge impact on the pandemic itself. If you then go to the CD29 and ivermectin, those drugs affect not the coronavirus. So remdesivir is an antiviral, it kills the virus. Ivermectin and CD29, these are drugs against the immune response. So this is what happens when you have the virus and your body overreacts to that virus and creates this massive immune response, which then goes and damages your other organs. You can stop that damage. But again, you have to remember that those drugs are essentially death prevention drugs. They are not disease curing drugs, if you like. So they are at the middle of the path. Remdesivir is at the end of that path. What we are really looking for is something that can be much earlier in the path, which can either be a prophylactic, which means that you can give it to people if they have been exposed. So Regeneron's antibody has been used like that. Lilly's antibody has also been used in that way. So if you have been exposed, you can now give that. So that's a very useful thing. We can open up the economy, we can immunize lots of people, but if there is an outbreak, we can swoop in and we can give people these very expensive antibody drugs and then try and stop them from developing a severe form of disease. So it would very much be like how we manage stroke today. So if somebody gets a stroke, we rapidly evacuate them. We take them to a hospital. We scan their brain very quickly to see if it's a bleed or if it's a clot. If it's a clot, we give them a drug. It's a clot busting drug. Blood circulation starts, and we have managed the whole long-term problem that this person would have had if we had not done it. So I think that what would be a game changer in this situation would be something which is towards the left end of this pathway rather than the right end of this pathway. And I do believe that there are some very interesting products, but they fall into two categories. One is what you mentioned, Bill. These are drugs we already know. So these are reprofiling drugs. These are reusing drugs that we already, repurposing what we already have. And I think, sadly, that is the only thing we can do in the time we have. Because to develop any new compound from scratch, you'll have to have several years of clinical trials before you can approve it, even with the best will in the world. So the best hope we have is an existing drug, repurposing it and using it at the early part of the disease. That's where I'm focusing.
I'd add one other thing. That my worry about what you just said, Vishal, and I'm curious to hear how you respond, is that the monoclonal antibodies are infusions. And the other difference between a stroke is the number needed to treat is far higher because you don't know exactly who's going to be most severe. So it's not just a question of cost, just the logistics of it would be hard. I know that the one other thing is there are long-acting monoclonal antibodies that are being investigated that might last 6 months or a year. And that might change the dynamics in the opportunity, but I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
So there are a couple of things. So yes, the current ones are infusions. So the Regeneron one is a combination of two antibodies. The Lilly Epstelara drug is one antibody.
In the United
And
States,
now
two were just approved. In the United States, just as of yesterday or a couple of days ago, Eli Lilly has a two dose monoclonal antibody version as well.
Oh, right. Okay. So that's good. So when I spoke to people at Epstelara recently, a lot of the interest now is to reduce, number one, reduce cost of goods, re-engineer the antibody so that it has higher affinity, so you need a lower dose, with the aim of making it a subcutaneous antibody injection rather than an infusion. So I think that those are the directions in which those companies are currently going. But it just reminds me of something which is a general, I think something that will have a large impact on the biopharmaceutical industry is what we are learning from this. Just like we made major advances in surgery during World War II because we were able to do lots of things which we couldn't do before the war. We could do it during the war. One of the things that is like that is that in two places, one in the antibody therapeutics place and also in the vaccine thing, pharma companies are now able to think in building their programs in an agile methodology. Until now, pharma innovation was a linear process. You start at one end, you run as fast as you can, and if something fails, you stop. And if something works, you don't touch it again. You just keep using it. But both of these two examples where we are going in with something which just kind of works, it is like a minimum viable product, and then we are continuously upgrading that product into getting better. So we can have a booster shot for the vaccine, or we can have a new antibody for the South African variant for an antibody, for example. So I think that one phenomenon is something that might change the pharmaceutical industry forever.
I can just add that in discussions at the IHME about therapeutics, there's been a lot of skepticism about many of the therapeutics that have come and gone, but there's been more promise and more hope in the monoclonal antibody area, and particularly some of the research that Eli Lilly is doing. So I just wanted to share that.
So, I think the interesting topic that all of you have sort of touched upon is sort of how the disease has been affecting age groups. And, clearly the priority to vaccinate, older, more at-risk people is key. In terms of, should we be a little less concerned? And Duncan had a good question that he put in the chat, and I'll just add, if anybody else has questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat, or raise your hand. We'll try to get to you. But the whole notion of allowing younger people who have so far, shown more resistance to serious symptoms of the disease, kind of in a sense allowing them to become infected, and thereby developing kind of innate antibodies and I guess by extension some immunity to the disease. Is that something that's reasonable? And I think it probably already it bears on this whole topic of variants as well. But what do you all think about that?
I am not in favor of that. And the reason I'm not in favor of that is that we have very sophisticated vaccine technology now, and we may be able to give people much more predictable immune response without exposing them to the virus. Because there is a common misconception that the immune response that it results from a natural disease is somehow better than what you get from vaccines. That's not always true. And I think that until we know the autoimmune consequences of long COVID and other things, I would very much be in favor of using a good, well-tested vaccine to be given to young people rather than expose them to the disease.
I would add one other thing here, and this is that it's a contagious disease. And so if a 20-year-old gets infected, yeah, we have to care about the 20-year-old, but I would care even more importantly about who the 20-year-old infects downstream. And so even after people are vaccinated, I think that we need to rely on the vaccine heavily as the
I agree. I think that's a very good point, Glenn. Also, the more opportunities we give to the virus to replicate in wild, the more variants can evolve. So I think any opportunity that we can take away from that virus, we should.
So, I think, Glenn, part of what you were talking about is sort of this progression of the disease so that it becomes, I guess the correct term is endemic, and becomes sort of, low level present, in society, things like that. Can you just expand, or perhaps repeat a little bit, because I think that's an important point that people need to understand, because I think as we begin to look longer term, kind of the expectation around that, is pretty important.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear how Vishal responds, to see if we're on the same page here. But my perception is this: I don't think that herd immunity is possible anymore. And here's the reason, for two reasons. One, we know that the persistence of immunity degrades over time. So within the first 3 months, we have pretty strong immunity, even whether it's natural infection or vaccination, pretty strong immunity. At around 4 months, around 10% of people can get reinfected. At around 5 to 6 months, it's around 20%. We don't know what that long persistence curve looks like, but the fact that maybe once every year or two, a fairly large portion of the population that had protective immunity will lose it over time means that this idea of hitting a threshold will be a moving target, and that's going to be hard. And then the second component is the variance of concern, which is really the main point of discussion here. An interesting case study was in Brazil, where some of the cities, they found that maybe as many as 70 to 75% of the population had been infected. But then when the new variant in Brazil emerged, a whole new surge erupted in those cities. And it demonstrated that this concept of herd immunity could not be achieved there. So then the question is, well, if we have this circulating virus, then what happens over time? And the concept of it becoming endemic is just that it sort of just continues over time. The question of whether we need a constant vaccine strategy that continues over time, or whether we can sort of constrain the emergent variants because of sufficient vaccination at any one point globally, that's going to determine sort of how we need to address it over time. As far as I can perceive, there's basically two different drivers of the variants. It has to do with people who get infected for the first time have a high viral load, and so then you can see sort of a diversity of strains that might occur within a single individual. In particular, people who are immunosuppressed have these really extraordinary life cycles of the virus. So in some people, we've seen documentation that some people who have been immunosuppressed, immunocompromised, might have replicating virus for 3 months or 5 months, or it just continues to sort of be a tug of war with the immune system. And so you see a wide, huge diversity of variants that can emerge in those people. And then finally, as we roll out vaccines in the wealthy countries, the poor countries, if we leave them behind, then another year or two, that's where all the variants are going to be emerging from. And so we really need to think of this as a global question in terms of addressing the variants. And so it's basically this dynamic in terms of understanding the development and emergence of these variants of concern and the new variants that can escape the vaccines versus our need to sort of develop new booster shots that would help to sort of shift our immune response to become more immunoprotective. Vishal, do you agree with that?
I agree with. I think we agree on more than we think.
Good.
So I do agree with what you're saying. I think that I also would like to enter into that combination, nasal vaccines, because I believe having a strong IgA response, which is a mucosal immune response against the virus, a virus that enters through the mucosa, would be the right way to go forward. And that would reduce, hopefully, transmission quite significantly. So I think that I'm holding out for that too, to add to what Glenn just said.
I will say at the IHME, despite the fact that this current wave is peaked in January, the numbers are improving.
Yes.
We are becoming less optimistic, more pessimistic about the idea of herd immunity. And one of the main risks, there are many and there are many unknowns, but one of the main risks is this recent trial that puts into doubt the idea that if you have antibodies for one variant, they will work with another variant. That's been upsetting and a source of risk.
I think that the way I think about it is I do not think about it in binary terms anymore after looking at the data. I think that even having a mild immune response against the virus at a population level can have significant effect on the R0 number. And I think that that's something which is reassuring. So, which is why I believe we should immunize as many people as we can with whatever vaccine that is available, because I think there are two sides. What seems to have happened is that somehow in this pandemic, when we look at vaccines, everyone just jumps at what does it mean for me, rather than looking at the public health impact of those vaccines. And I think that we would do well if we were able to educate society to think of taking the vaccine not for themselves, but also for what it means for your community and your country and your population. Because I believe that the immune response against any protein is quite varied and wide-ranging, and it's very different in different individuals receiving the same antigen. And I think that as a population, we may end up at a point where the R0s of the new variants just can't rise high enough for those outbreaks to spread across countries. So you may have local outbreaks in one part of the world, and if we get better at having travel bans and other things, we can probably stop it there. But those are all opportunities that exist in front of us.
We've got a question from the group from Paul talking about Israel's success. And he asked, did they just procure more of the vaccines, or is it the fact that they have been able to organize their logistical effort, in a more superior way? Obviously, they're a smaller country, so there's less of a challenge there. But nonetheless, do you guys have any further insight on that?
My only insight was based on what I've seen in the UK. So when I call up my friends who are running these vaccine centers, when I ask them how many people you vaccinated today, and if they vaccinated fewer people than the day before, I ask them why. It's always the fact that they did not receive the vaccines that they were expecting to receive. So I'm getting the sense that at least in the UK, the cap is availability of vaccine doses rather than our ability to inject people.
Yeah, my perception is I definitely see that as the driver in Israel. They simply had more doses available. But then also, it's not quite socialized medicine there. My understanding is that there's essentially around 3 large systems. And so because they have more control, they know who's gotten the vaccine, who needs it, and the level of risk associated with people. So it really makes it more dynamic and precise in terms of their ability to roll it out. Whereas in the United States, in contrast, I don't know how it compares to UK, but it's pretty much every person for themselves here. You look at 20 different websites trying to see where you can sign up for a vaccine. It's supposed to be based on the risk, but I know a lot of people who are like, oh, I'm 40 years old and I really, really want the vaccine. Let me just sign up anyway. And it's a real mess here in the United States.
So I think it's slightly different here. I think this is one of the things that socialized medicine does well. They have very, very good lists. So it was very easy so essentially the only advice I could give to my friends who have elderly parents is to call up your primary care physician and make sure that you have a mobile number registered for your parents, because you get a message as a text message. And if you don't have that registered, then you get it as a letter in the post. And I don't want to lose that letter in the post. So I just want to make sure that everyone that I know has the right SMS number inside in the records. And if you do have it, when your turn comes, you will get a message. And that's what happened. My mother-in-law, she's 92. She just got a text message, which my wife had registered her number, got the text message, made sure she got it. She got it on the third day of the vaccine program being launched.
Yeah, personal story. So my folks who are in their 90s live in an assisted living facility, and the governor here did prioritize, those people in those types of living situations. They just got their second shots this past Sunday, and as far as I know, a lot of the facilities have been able to accomplish this. So that's done well. Kind of sidebar, it will be very interesting to see, since they now are somewhat of a closed community, how things begin to open up and how things interact with them. Very, very small scale, but nonetheless, I think it's interesting. I'll also say that, here in Florida, it really kind of comes down to the county level. And I know that initially, there are some kind of horror stories of, people waiting 12 hours in their cars in various counties to try to, get in line for it. Here in Orange County in Central Florida, I can say, because for better or for worse, I'm just over 65, so I managed to squeak in. I got my second shot on Monday, and the process, for all intents and purposes, was really pretty painless and relatively straightforward. The computer system the state of Florida seems to be using is quite good. I've been surprised at that. I managed to get it through the Orlando health system. They've been very good, even though my first appointments got messed up. They were quick to automatically kind of reshuffle me into a second queue. Got scheduled very well. I was completely surprised. It took me all of like 25 minutes in and out to get my second shot. I was actually somewhat disappointed that there wasn't more of a line that was there. So it's it's wide and varied, but at least I'm happy to report that at least there's one success story.
Bill, that's great news. I think that's fantastic example. I believe that we should have something like the Burger Index that the economists have for different regions in the world, including cities and towns and counties, which will be called the shot in the arm index, of saying how good the government works. And I think that could be used by real estate agents to then find price property appropriately in those places.
Well, Florida home sales are up. I can tell you that.
Well, for whatever it's worth, you don't look like a Florida man.
Chris White,
Is there any difference between the mutation rate for this virus and other viruses with which we are more familiar?
It's lower, Chris. The mutation rates for this virus are much lower than many other viruses that we have. Some of the viruses which we suffer from, like flu, they have a very different mechanism of mutation. They're almost designed to mutate. So that's a very different one. But this virus is mutating far more slowly than it could, which is good news, I guess. So in other words, if somebody had engineered it, they engineered it really, really badly.
So, let's see, we've got another question in the chat here. I guess, Vishal, particularly for you, do you have a favorite of your oral antiviral? Yeah, I think, I'm sorry, view on oral antiviral, I'm gonna mess this up, favipiravir?
Yes, so yes, that's right. It has been tried. So there was this is a drug, I think, developed by a Japanese pharmaceutical company, and they did the first trial in Japan. And then they took long time to recruit in their second trial. But there was a randomized trial done in the UK, which did not show any benefit over standard of care. So I think that we will have to wait for another trial to show anything different. Until then, I don't think we can say that it is actually protective. So the difference between those that were treated and untreated was quite small.
Vishal, this is Andres Trevino. How are you? I just asked the
Hi.
question. And I've been following a company called Apply, and they are working with in a consortium with Dr. Reddy's laboratories and Global Resource Response Aid.
Yes.
And they did a study, and the results were like the Apply hypothesis is that the earlier in the treatment timeline patients receive, like as early as they receive the antivirals or the treatment is likely to have a higher benefit for the treatment. So basically they show that if you take it early on, let's say the first 3-4 days, you're gonna have a difference of probably 2 to 3 days to leave the hospital earlier. You even have to go to the hospital. Do you think
Yes.
that happened in some cases?
So I know for a fact that my friends in India are using this drug regularly. Almost every patient in India is getting favipiravir. They were getting it before the clinical trial read out, and they're still getting it after the clinical trial has read out. So I just think we have to look at more data, because I think we haven't seen conclusive data one way or the other yet.
Okay. Thank you.
And let's see, and another question that's sort of been bopping around, and Steve, maybe this is a little bit more in your ballpark on the IHME, but you know, there are folks out there that have put forward the possibility of yet another spike. I guess, you know, particularly with regard to the variants. But you know, Steve, I know that IHME, you know, it's trying to incorporate a lot of these factors into their modeling. And, you know, the graphs so far don't show any indications of that unless we just all sort of give up on the restrictions. But do you want to comment on that? And, you know, other guys, you know, you can jump in as well.
Yes, there's another risk beyond just giving up on the restrictions and being overly relaxed. And that gets back to the idea that the variants are not only spreading through the US, but we find that any protection works particularly badly for these variants, so that the outcomes are a lot worse. And we think that if that's the case, we will know by May. And that we could, you know, it's not the high probability case, but there's a low probability dire case that we get a bigger than expected spike in May. That's the downside. And it has to do with the idea that, number one, the variant spread maybe even more than we fear, and number two, any antibodies that either from vaccines or from contracting it previously work particularly badly against these new variants.
So I think, Steve, you're talking about antibody-dependent enhancement, which is a phenomenon which is found in other viruses, where a previous infection makes you much more susceptible to severe infection next time. And it's seen commonly in dengue virus. So if you have infection with dengue virus one time, and you have a different variant next time, the next disease is much worse than the first one. And yes, there is a risk of that. I think that IHME is probably correct in saying that it is a relatively low probability risk, but nevertheless it exists.
Wasn't it found, Vishal, in the SARS-CoV-1, some of the clinical trials early on for SARS? I think that they identified it there.
That's right. So one of the big risks, the reason why every one of us globally was so excited when the vaccine data came out was because in the back of our minds, we were worried about this as well. And the idea was not just to, in fact, if you cast your mind before the vaccine data started to come out, there was a very strong belief all across that there will never be a vaccine against this. And I think I'm glad that we have shown that we can have a viable vaccine against it. I mean, there is a research report issued by one of the preeminent investment banks in biotech called Leerink, and their analysts issued a report of saying 20 reasons why there won't be a vaccine against coronavirus. And I sent it back to him when the vaccine was approved. And I was very, very pleased to be able to do that.
Bill, the one other, or Steve, I guess, the one other thing that's interesting in terms of the variants, when you look at the spread in the United States in particular, the vast majority of the spread is among the UK variant in particular. And the UK variant is susceptible to the current vaccination strategy. It's the
Guys,
other
guilty as charged. Guilty as charged. Sorry, guys.
So I apologize for calling it the UK variant. I should be calling it the B117. But so I think that if we see a surge in May, I think it's largely to be among the unvaccinated people rather than a variant breaking through the vaccine. So I'm not as concerned about the variants breaking in so early at this point.
Yes, that's right. I think that the key thing here, one thing to remember is that if we are looking at whether the variants are escaping from the current vaccines, we already have a massive clinical trial ongoing. All the millions of people who have been vaccinated have all been, including Bill, are recruited in that trial. Because we will see the immunity break. If it breaks, we will see that very, very quickly. So I think the good news here is that at least we will know very quickly. I hope it doesn't happen that way, but we will know it. So we should not live under this fear that it is happening and we don't know it. We will know it.
Yeah.
My one worry is in the United States is how much genetic screening we're doing. We've been so terrible at it in the United States. I think that we're improving with the new administration, but we need to dramatically increase the funding to do increased genetic screening because right now it's a huge weakness that we have. And so variants could be emerging and we can't really critically evaluate it as much because we're kind of playing in ghost mode to those who play video games, where it's hard to even know what's going on if we just don't have the data to support it in the United States.
I think there's another factor that bears mentioning, and beyond the science, beyond the technology, beyond the developments, simply the idea that too high a percentage of the population, and particularly in certain sectors, are refusing to take the vaccine or believe that they might not be interested in taking the vaccine. So there's a big educational opportunity that could have a very big upside if we can get more people to agree.
I think that's a really interesting point. I saw some really, really positive data from France. As you know, France leads the world, not just in making great wine, but also in anti-vax attitude. So there's the highest level of people in surveys who don't want to take vaccines is in France around the world. And they did this survey. They asked the same question every week to people with a similar population in France, whether they would take a coronavirus vaccine. And the percentage of people who now say yes grows every week. So my belief is that as the vaccine, becomes normalized, as they watch their friends, their family members, their neighbors take vaccine, they see other people on television taking vaccine, I think that we will find that more people will want to take it. But I do believe that there will still be some hardcore people who will not take it, and in which case I just expect evolution to take care of that. That's how Darwinism works.
So one last personal data point, as well, was a big question. I contracted COVID back in July, and I was very curious to see if I continued to have the antibody because, there was a strain of thought that was going around, said, your antibodies only lasted for a couple months. And, I'm pleased to say that with the blood work, that was involved, I still have it. So, it's been a good number of months, after that. So there's a mechanism that is residual. And now, in addition to that, having been able to receive the vaccine. So hopefully we'll keep going.
Bill, just about that, what happens is that your body builds antibodies and they don't survive forever. So the B cells that are designed to produce that specific antibody, they can go and rest in your bone marrow for a long period of time. And they get reactivated when your body sees that antigen again with the help of memory T cells, which is what you do with the second dose of the vaccine. what you're doing is you are training the memory T cells. And then after that, you can have a situation where you don't actually find any antibodies in the blood. But if you were infected again, your memory T cells would activate those B cells and you will have an antibody surge as a result of that.
That's, the mechanics are super helpful to understand, because I think that so many people don't realize, how the biology works. So,
well, the problem is that they used to keep immunologists like me locked in the back room because nobody wanted to talk to us. But now we are very popular. So it's like it's Glenn's first slide about epidemiologists. I think the world is listening to different type of people.
right. You guys are rock stars now, that's for sure. So
On that point, like who else would you like to include in our next round? Both either the panelists or
I think we should have someone who's probably involved in some of the therapeutics. So someone who's managing a clinical trial on some of the therapeutics. I think maybe we get them to get a different picture. Maybe get someone from say India who's involved in the vaccination program, or someone like that. I think that despite Glenn, Steve, and I being in different continents, we do end up talking about the same things. So it'd be good to have a diversity of thought.
we'll try to be more inclusive next time.
Other thoughts?
Go ahead, Mark.
Just curious, other thoughts before we all break, so they're well fresh in the mind. Anyone else on the call?
The one thing that I could think of, so the United States, I think we're about to have a dramatic shift in the government management of the epidemic in the United States. And so when you look at the Biden administration plan, I think that we're about to see increased investment, and that's going to hopefully have an influence. I mean, at this point, when you look at the IHME models and the what we saw, it's already going on a natural decrease based on the existing amount of mask wearing and social distancing and other restrictions. But going forward, the government interventions in the United States, I think, will play an important role in fighting the pandemic fatigue and these other things. And that might be something interesting as well.
And I guess maybe just as a final point too, in terms of the vaccine rollout, as we go down, do you guys think, continuing to do it by age cohort, since there's a pretty good correlation in terms of, severity of outcome, by it, that would be the better way to go?
I do believe that to be the case. I think that I can't think of another way I could, age and profession are the only two metrics that we should use. And front-facing professionals of any type, I would start with, healthcare professionals, then other people in front-facing industries. I think that that's what I would think about. I think if we could, I do not believe, and I probably get things thrown at me, which is why Zoom is very good to say things like that, is that I don't think that that school teachers would be, just by immunizing school teachers, we will take away all the risk of opening schools. I think that the risk of opening schools is also related to parents and other people that are in contact with the families. So I would wait to open schools until we have immunized a lot of the population at home, as it were, before we get kids into schools.
I think in the United States, it's a little bit different. The three things I'm worried about with the vaccination strategy is, first, making sure the people at highest risk of severe symptoms and mortality are addressed first, but then also at some point focusing on the people at highest risk of spreading the
Yes,
disease. And that's
correct,
something.
correct.
But then there's also the worry about the variants of concern. So for instance, right now, a lot of the vaccine trials haven't really looked at the immunocompromised folks as much. And I think that we really should prioritize them, even if they're not as responsive to the vaccine.
Yes.
And
But they
so
are, so So in the UK, after we have gone to 75-year-olds, the next is clinically vulnerable populations. That includes all people on immune compromise, who are immune compromised because of the drugs they're taking or because of other conditions. So that's how the cascade flows. It starts up with age, goes up to 75. As soon as it hits 75, then it splits into two. One is continues by age band, and the other one goes to what we are calling clinically vulnerable populations. And then those get covered in that line. So I think that that's how we are trying to deal with that. And I think we should continue to deal with that. I saw in New York Times yesterday that a Soul Cycle instructor managed to get on the list as an educationist. So I think some of these things are really worrying. I did check with one of my colleagues who's chairman of one of the hospitals. I asked, he's of a certain age, so I asked him, Bruce, have you got your vaccine? And he says, no, I shouldn't get it until it's my age because I'm not in a frontline job. I'm just the chairman. And then he told me that the chief executive of that hospital managed to get himself vaccinated. And he got into serious trouble because other front-facing staff in the hospital were just wanting to walk away. It's quite hard to get away with that here. It's very, very socialist in that sense.
Vishal, it's a mess in the United States. It's a free-for-all here. The one other thing I think that's a distinction in the United States that I'd worry about is this idea of equity across different populations. So for instance, we have socioeconomic status constraints and also ethnic constraints here, where because of the just the way that it's rolling out, a lot of people, and maybe some of the ethnic minorities in the United States, tend to live with a lot more people in the same household under tighter conditions. And with socioeconomic status, it's something similar. And so we've seen a dramatic increase on burden in terms of morbidity and mortality on some ethnic populations in the United States. And so I think we need to prioritize some of those populations. It's related to this idea of risk, and so it should fall in that. But I don't know that in the United States, age alone is the best metric for capturing that because of the reason.
One other caveat I would mention is that locally we've seen some logistical issues where the right intent was made to prioritize the groups that needed it the most. You know, we talked about age, we talked about occupation, but such attention was paid to that there were unintended consequences, and sometimes there was a mismatch between the supply and the people who were targeted, and vaccines were mismatched, and then they ended up expiring and not going to people that could use them, and so there are
Yes.
some unintended consequences.
I think those have been challenges everywhere. So almost it seems like Pfizer's packaging strategy was almost a social experiment to add one extra dose in each vial. It was just a test of how we deal with such moral challenges. And I think that in future we will remember that.
Very good. Well, we've gone a bit over our stated time frame, so I just want to say thank you so very much. Steve, Vishal, Glenn, we really appreciate your contributions to this topic because obviously it affects us all. It affects our decision making. I know it's a big topic, here at our family office. So we just so very appreciate you spending the time with us. Looks like number 5 will be coming up on the books. So to everyone else, thank you so much for your time. Keep those cards and letters coming in because we want to make this responsive to your needs. And so Mark, I'll hand it back to you to close it out.
No, I echo Bill. Thanks, Vishal, Steve, and Glenn. This was great. I wrote earlier it's better than Bloomberg. I really, I think we really need to get there. This will be recorded. This is recorded, and we'll want to share this. I forget what show I was watching in the 70s when you keep the cards coming in, but just ping us in a more real time way. Thank you again, Bill. I think. Let us know. Sounds like therapeutics will be on hand next time, and you know, we do have an India deep dive, so that maybe we could make that part of some insights there.
Yeah.
And I mean, some of the questions we all have is, you know, I mean, there's a Russia vaccine. Some of our Russians are well, and there's a lot more that we always say we're going to know a lot more in a month. So whether it's a month or 2 months or 6 weeks, look forward to it, Bill and team. Thank you.
Very
Thank
good.
you.
All right.
Thank you
Have a
very
good
much
rest
for
of the week,
inviting us.
Thank
everyone.
you. Appreciate
Stay
it.
safe.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.